Welcome to Strange Planet. It's the oldest unsolved mystery in human history, a story told by the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and dismissed by modern science as myth. But what if they were wrong? What if Atlantis never sank beneath the sea? Because it was never in the sea to begin with. Tonight we go far beyond the waves into deserts that were once oceans and mountains that were once bordered inland seas. My guest is Jack Kelley, Yale-educated filmmaker, author, and the director of the Atlantis Puzzle, the explosive international documentary that dared to challenge everything we thought we knew about Plato's lost world. Now, with the release of his new book by the same name, Jack says he's gone way deeper, unpacking the real Greek words of Timaeus and Critias, exposing 2,000 years of mistranslation and revealing a hidden geography buried, not beneath the Atlantic, but beneath our assumptions. He's the first filmmaker ever to partner with Greek engineer and researcher George Sarantitis, the man some now call the modern discoverer of Atlantis. And together, they claim to have decoded Plato's riddle, that Atlantis was not a sunken continent, but a vanished civilization, drowned in time, not water, during a prehistoric age when the Sahara was green and humanity was far older, far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. From carved wooden beams 500,000 years old in Zambia to Stone Age seafarers on Crete 125,000 years ago to trade routes that spanned continents long before recorded history, Jack's evidence paints a stunning picture of an ancient world far more advanced, interconnected, and mysterious than we ever imagined. Forget everything you think you know about Atlantis. This isn't myth, it's history. Mistranslated, misplaced, and misunderstood. And tonight we're about to solve the Atlantis Puzzle. Jack Kelley, welcome back to Strange Planet. How are you?
Richard, thanks so much for having me. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm not sure I have any more to add.
Well, we should add that this book is, it's not just the documentary in print, the documentary that came out in 2024. Just give us a sense of, what areas of the documentary, what areas of the book didn't make it into the documentary. How did you beef it up?
Sure. Well, the Atlantis story is vast. And as you mentioned, George Sarantitis, who was the Greek researcher who originally figured most of this stuff out, his own work is pretty voluminous and unfortunately out of print these days. So when we were doing the research for the documentary in 2024, there was simply so many wonderful gems and elements that you just can't fit into a 80-minute documentary. So I felt my job wasn't finished. And what I wanted to do was, along the spine of the story that we tell in the documentary, fill in the blanks that we had to leave on the cutting room floor. And among those elements was a much deeper dive into the archaeology, the climate, and the history of the Green Sahara period, which, for those who don't know, was from around 11,000 to about 3,000 BC. And we're talking about North Africa, the area of the modern-day Sahara, which, shockingly to me, was once green. And digging into that, the deeper you go, the more interesting facts that you unearth, and those facts don't always match up with at least the science and the history that I learned in high school or college.
You mentioned George Sarantitis. Just take us back to when you met him, again, the modern discoverer of Atlantis, and how did that encounter change the course of your career and your understanding of the myth of Atlantis?
Yeah, Richard, most of the really interesting things in life don't come because you're looking for them. They appear. Sarantitis' work I discovered while I was on the Greek island of Santorini. I think it was back in 2019. And my wife and I were on vacation. I'd gone out to see an ancient site called Akrotiri, which is well worth visiting. Incredible buried city from 1600 BC, destroyed by the volcanic eruption that just blasted that island apart. And while we were there, I'm sitting in the hotel lobby waiting for a taxi or something, and there's a bookshelf, and my wife says, "Hey, take a look at this book. This might be interesting to you." And it was a conference that had taken place 2008, and it featured, a lot of different people's ideas, but in there I just found Sarantitis' work. I didn't have a book with me, started reading it by the pool, and my mind just blew because, I'm a reasonably well-educated guy. I studied the classics and ancient history and Latin and stuff at Yale. So I'm reading this, and a lot of these theories had a lot of holes in them, but Sarantitis had gone back and he had uncovered that there were a couple key mistranslations in the way the Atlantis story had been presented in its two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, throughout most of recent history. And when you go back and you examine those two understandings or those mistranslations, suddenly the picture of what Plato was talking about shifts. And I think that key shift is really what convinced me that this was a story worth investigating and then going through the years of work to tell that story to the world.
Right. So in other words, Atlantis didn't sink beneath the waves. It sunk from our memories and our minds because of thousands and thousands of years of mistranslation. Much of it hinges on this mistranslation. So maybe we've talked about this on your previous appearance on Strange Planet, but for those who haven't seen it, and I will link, I'll put a link in the episode description for our first episode that we did some time ago, but a crash course, Timaeus and Critias, Plato's Timaeus and Critias. Who were they, and just give us the thumbnail sketch.
Right. So these are two books written by Plato toward the end of his career, probably around 360 BC. And for those who don't know Plato, he was one of the most famous philosophers of the ancient world, the classical world. He lived in Athens, Greece. So Plato wrote these two books toward the end of his life, and they both books speak about this story which pertains to this ancient civilization known as Atlantis, and that supposedly was from around 9,600 BC, give or take. Now, these are also works of philosophy, so you have to keep in mind, well, what is this story doing in a book about philosophy? It's a little unclear. And Timaeus is a completed book. In fact, it was one of the most popular books in the early Renaissance by Plato because a lot of his work hadn't been translated. But Critias is left unfinished, and it just cuts off mid-sentence. And this has boggled people's minds for centuries. People have argued about this. Well, did Plato have a seizure while he was writing the last line and he didn't finish it? But he wrote another book after those two books called The Laws, which is his longest book. So it seemed like he was clearly in good mental shape, and he was still surely able to write. So the question is, why is that book cut off? Was it because he got bored? Was it he wanted to write the laws instead? He had a dinner party to go to and he forgot about it. Nobody knew. And one of the things that Sarantitis kind of figured out is that he believed that nothing Plato wrote was by accident, and that this was intentional, and it was meant to kind of point our attention back to some concepts that the broader story of Atlantis addresses. So not only is the story about the loss of not just one, but two ancient civilizations, the ancient Greeks as well as the Atlanteans, but it's also in the very structure of which it's written. It implies an unfinished story and that you need to look for something to complete the story.
So which single Greek word really flips the entire narrative for you?
Yeah, so George is the one who figured this out, and he was reading through these translations. And for those who don't know, I mean, the story of Atlantis from, I believe it was 1882, Ignatius Donnelly wrote this book called The Antediluvian World. And that's really where this idea of a lost continent in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean came from. But the fact of the matter is that Donnelly was working from translations of the Atlantis story in Timaeus and Critias that were not totally correct. And what they say, the translators interpret it as there was this continent, it was in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But what the actual ancient Greek says, and I have a very minimal, basic understanding of ancient Greek, is Atlantic Pelagos. Well, what's a Pelagos? A Pelagos is just a Greek word for a sea that's partially enclosed by land and, islands. Today's modern Greeks, if you look at, a map of Greece and in the country of Greece, it says Aegean Pelagos, right? Or the Ionian Pelagos. They refer to these seas in different ways. The ancient Greeks also had other words for seas, though. The Mediterranean was considered a thalassa. What we call the Black Sea was the Euxenos Pontos, which really means a brackish sea which is friendly to strangers, which had to do with the fact the Greeks had established trading ports there over a period of time. Before they did that, it was known as the Euxenos Pontos, not friendly to strangers. So what you can take from this, Richard, is obviously that ancient Greek was a very specific language. Anyone who's studied Latin or Greek knows what I'm talking about. The logic and the grammar and the syntax, it's really important. So if Plato meant to use the word okeanos, which he uses in other books he wrote, he would have done so. I mean, you don't tell someone you went fishing on a lake if you were on a pond, or you don't tell them you're out at the Atlantic Ocean when you're in Hudson Bay. So the idea that to get to Atlantis, you had to cross a body of water known as the Atlantic Pelagos, coming from Greece, meant that these previous translators had assumed that meant the Atlantic Ocean because no one had ever heard of an Atlantic Pelagos before. And if those who have seen the documentary will know where we went with this, but basically what George started looking at was, well, if I go back in time, is there a body of water that matches up to this description? And lo and behold, there is. And this body of water also had to access the Mediterranean, which it did. So if you go back to the Green Sahara and you go back 8, 9, 10, 11,000 years, you'll find a completely different world, a world that's more like maybe today's Serengeti. And there were massive, massive lakes. I mean, Lake Chad, which today is tiny, was the size of modern Germany. That gives you an idea of the world that you're dealing with, a much more aquatic world. I mean, crocodiles spread all the way across Africa. Fish swam from the Congo, up to the Mediterranean. And I think one of the most eye-opening parts of this story, Richard, was realizing that, just like this idea of a lost world, the lost world doesn't mean that it disappeared under the ocean. It means that it just doesn't look the way that it used to look.
Right. So Atlantis, again, not an oceanic continent that sank, but a real city lost to changing climate and inland seas. Can you explain that shift?
Yeah, I suppose. I mean, in terms of the climate or in terms of the population?
I guess the landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is a baffling. I mean, so basically, the Sahara shifts every 20,000 years, and there's these things called I don't want to get too detailed, but there's these things called the Milankovitch cycles, which have to do with these little deviations in the Earth's orbit and these tilts, and the way that the precession of the equinoxes is happening, and so forth, and all this adds up to this incredible 20,000 year cycle, give or take, that has been going on for at least 8 million years as far as we can tell. And so every 20,000 years, there's this shift from dry to wet conditions across the entire area of North Africa, which is an area, bigger than Australia or the United States. And so when that happens, you get this change, and it starts with this precipitation, this greening. You get more vegetation, it holds more water in the soil. there's more evaporation. Now you got more clouds, there's more rain, and then the whole cycle continues. And one of the things that's been argued about is how rapidly this can take place. But the thing that we sort of miss is actually due to human influence climate change. It's happening now. So I spoke to Dr. Stefan Kropelin, who's a German desert researcher, a bit of like a German Indiana Jones, who spent a lot of his life out in the Sahara. And he told me he'd be out there and he'd see signs that the desert was regreening thousands of years ahead of schedule. So, and this also probably influenced the Egyptian civilization in the sense that, when the pasture lands and the hunting grounds start to dry out, people converge on the Nile River Valley. And what does that coincide with? Well, the dawn of the pharaonic, unified Egyptian civilization that we know about from about 3,500 BC. So it's a remarkable chain of natural events that led to shifts in the populations of these areas and how people were living.
Just curious as to how mainstream translators got this wrong for centuries. I mean, I don't know, was it academic inertia, or did someone intentionally flatten Plato's meaning?
Richard, I think that this is one of the biggest takeaways of this whole story, and maybe we'll talk about this a little more as it relates to some of the other parts of it, but these people made an assumption, and they were conditioned by the culture and the awareness they had. If you go back 150 years, nobody really understood climate change. Heinrich Barth was, again, another German who was one of the first European explorers to cross significant portions of North Africa on foot or by camel or whatever. And, he uncovered all this rock art and these carvings and these, cave paintings and all kinds of stuff showing, huge representations of crocodiles and hippos and elephants and giraffes in the middle of what was just bleak desert. And so the question started to arise, how did these people know what these things were from thousands of miles away, and what caused this tremendous change? And so I think the translators of the prior era, they just made an assumption based on the knowledge they had. Well, this couldn't possibly be real. I've never heard of an Atlantic Pelagos, and my name is Dr. Chauncey P. Q. Spoon IV. And I'm at Oxford, and I know everything, so therefore it must have been the Atlantic Ocean. They didn't know what it might have been, and there didn't exist this knowledge of the Green Sahara that we have today, where we could say, aha. So one of the brilliant things Sarantitis did was he put these two things together. He said, wait, I'm not looking for an ocean, I'm looking for an inland sea or series of inland seas. That's what these words mean. And Plato's no moron. He's going to use words for something he means. So this leads us to the idea that the world he was describing existed in sort of northwest Africa. And if you go back to the Green Sahara and you look at the map of the giant megalakes and river systems that existed there, it just hits you like a ton of bricks. This was the geography Plato was talking about. And right in the middle of it, you have this bizarre construct, the Rashat structure, which I'm sure your audience is well familiar with.
Yeah, Eye of the Sahara.
So a lot of people get really excited about this idea because, listen, the geography is it's almost a perfect match for the way Plato describes this ringed concentric city. Now, a lot of people, including people I know, have gone out there to really take a hard look, and archaeologists have been out there. There are stone ruins and things in, hundreds of them in this area. The problem is this stuff hasn't been dated, so nobody knows when these things are from, and they don't look exactly like the city that Plato described in the myth. So again, here we have this story of, is this all true? Is it all false? were we being misdirected, or did people not understand? Well, it's probably a blend of all these things, right? You have real geography. The climate was different. This is a real physical place. The question remains, how much of the myth was something that pre-existed that Plato adapted for his own purposes, right? So the society he describes sounds a lot more like a Bronze Age or even like an ancient or classical Greek society, right? They fight with chariots, right? They don't fight with spaceships and laser beams. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you've said your mission was to separate the wheat from the chaff, the true versus false Atlantis. So what survives scrutiny and what belongs to Hollywood or ancient alien fantasy?
That's a great question. And this is one of the things where no matter what I say, someone's going to hate me. If I look at the thousands of comments the film has gotten in different places, some people say this is the best documentary I've seen in 20 years. Someone else literally called it crapola. And so I'm saying, well, look, guys, I'm doing the best I can. I'm trying to use facts. If, angels from Alpha Centauri came down in the form of UFOs and mind washed all of us and created all this, maybe they did, but I don't have any proof of that. What we do have proof of is people were living at the Rashat tens of thousands of years ago. There's stone tools, there's evidence. People lived there. I talked to an earthquake and disaster expert at Oregon State University, Dr. Scott Ashford, and we looked at, look at this geography and look at what was happening at the time with the monsoon belts and so forth. This is a great place for a flood to take place. So you could have had some type of ancient, think about like a Göbekli Tepe type of society or something like that. People living there, and they could have gotten blasted by a flood. When you live in a place that's surrounded on, 2.5 sides by cliffs, and you're in the middle of the Green Sahara and there's massive monsoons, that's a great way to get flooded. And that could have been the seed of a story which cascaded down through history, and which maybe Plato or travelers picked up in a later form. So let's talk about some of the things that are false. So, Hollywood often portrays Atlantis as kind of these, you got Aquaman, right? You got guys who can talk to fish and fly in the air. They're shooting lasers powered by crystals and things of that nature. And yeah, again, people who want to believe that there was an ancient technologically advanced society, I mean, maybe there could be lost chapters of our history that we don't know about, but you really have to look at the evidence hard. And because if Richard, you say, I think fish people ran Atlantis, and I say, I think they don't. How are we going to settle the argument, right? We got to have some standard that we can use to settle the debate. So one of the things that we did when we were going through this story is, we really did a lot of hard research. I personally read probably 100 scientific papers to try and get to the bottom of, what might a society have looked like at that time? And some of the things I found defied my personal expectations, right? Because we have this idea, if you go back to kind of the Stone Age, you got these kind of dirty people hunched over with a club over their shoulder, trying to bash, deer over the head and drag them back to their cave. But the reality doesn't support that. The deeper you look, the more you start to see people were much more sophisticated than we have ever given them credit for. And every discovery we make does not push things nearer to us in terms of inventions. It pushes them farther back in time. I'll give you a great example. Seafaring. I thought for sure, in the Atlantis story, it talks about them having a big, armada of boats and so forth. And you'd say, could this have been true? I thought for sure this is fake or couldn't be substantiated. Well, I was wrong. If you go back to, there was a great discovery near, I think it was Nigeria in 1987. A guy digging a well hit this 30-foot canoe, and he didn't know what it was. He just, called his village elders, and they wound up digging this up. It's called the Defuna canoe. It's dated to about 6,500 BC. And it was found kind of on the borders of what would have been Lake Megachad, right? This enormous lake the size of Germany in the middle of North Africa. Well, if people had one canoe, you can be sure they had thousands. I mean, this is not one guy with a canoe. We've just lost this stuff because wood tends to rot away. And if you think about, I live in the American Southwest, and there's many old buildings made out of adobe. But if they didn't maintain these buildings, I'll tell you, in a couple hundred years, they would just be dust. And so you can think there could be, there could be entire settlements which have just evaporated or disintegrated over time because they were built with stone and wood and adobe brick and things of that nature. So, the seafaring thing goes back even further. And I think you and I had exchanged an article about, Crete. And Crete's the largest island in Greece. And some astonishing evidence was found there showing that ancient human seafaring goes back, to multiple eras. They found evidence: 9,000 BC, 25,000, 40,000, 80,000, 125 to 130,000 years ago. Well, that just blew my mind. So you're telling me people were out sailing around in some kind of boat. We don't know it was a dugout canoe or did it have a sail? Nobody knows. All you know is the secondary evidence. People were there, and we can see their stone tools, and they're buried in layers that we can date. So, you tell me what was going on. I don't know. All I know is
another example. I mean, the Bronze Age. There's not enough copper in Europe, for example, to explain how the Bronze Age took off. And a lot of theories suggest they were mining copper on the shores of Lake Superior. Some evidence suggests elaborate mining operations there. How did they haul that copper back across the Atlantic? And they must have had, pretty massive vessels. And again, we're talking, well, you tell me, when was the Bronze Age? 3,500 BC or something like that?
It varied just depending on where you were. Different people had the tech at different times. But yeah, anywhere from, 1,000 BC to, 3,500 BC or earlier. Yeah. So you're right. You're 100% right. The use of metals was another one, which is, the deeper you go, the more puzzling it gets, because you got to ask yourself, well, why was metallurgy invented in a particular place at a specific time? If people were just using stone tools, how do you and I one day just suddenly decide, well, we found this stuff, we're going to throw it in a fire and we're going to melt it and turn it into a tool? And one of the baffling things, you're right. I mean, the Greeks knew, for example, going back to the ocean, that there was an ocean outside the bounds of the Mediterranean. Some people have suggested, they didn't know about that. Yes, they knew. 100% they knew. And why? Because to your point about the Bronze Age, there was a tin trade with the British Isles going on because you need tin and copper to make bronze, and that's well documented. So you're telling me they knew to go out there and sail up at the Atlantic, but they didn't know the Atlantic was there? I mean, come on. We have this idea that ancient people were dumb, and I think that's one of the biggest takeaways from writing this book, is realizing just how smart and advanced prehistoric people were, even if they didn't have computers or spaceships. Going back to the seafaring thing, I'll just drop a couple others. Neanderthals apparently were also seafaring. There's evidence that Neanderthal tools are found on these Greek islands that were not connected to the mainland 200,000 years ago. And the tools look like they're the tools that Neanderthals made. So if humans can sail 125,000 years ago and Neanderthals were sailing 200,000 years ago, you'd think, okay, maybe I can buy that. How about 1 million years ago, Richard?
Wow.
Southeast Asia, there's evidence in 2 different islands, Philippines and Indonesia, islands that were never connected to the mainland at any point in time, that they found these woolly rhino bones that were clearly butchered by stone tools. And that means somebody sailed out there. And the only humans we know of at that time were Homo erectus, who were supposed to be naked, hairy, and barely could use fire. So I think we have this incorrect idea about how smart our ancestors were. And I think the bigger question is, why have we developed technology in the last few hundred years and we were just as smart before that? That's a more interesting question to me.
Right, right. So let's talk about the land versus water peoples. First of all, when was the Holocene era?
So the Holocene is just a term that we use today to describe, around 9600 BC, kind of down to the present, right? And it's people have made a lot about the fact that 9600 BC matches right up with Plato's time for this Atlantean War. Is that coincidence, or is it some cultural memory of a big climate shift that was taking place, maybe a series of natural disasters? Maybe that marked an epoch of human cultural change. So two major groups in North Africa, you have the land people, they called the land people and the water people. The water people spoke the language called Nilo-Saharan. And those people kind of originated in the area of like modern sort of Sudan or Ethiopia. And they sort of spread westward and northward during the Green Sahara. Prior to that, they were separated from this other group of people who was called the land people. Those people lived in the area around modern-day Mauritania and the Western Sahara. So that's on the west side of Africa. So these people were separated for like thousands of years. And when the climate changed and the animals started moving into the savanna, you got almost like this yin-yang movement where these people spread out rapidly and would have encountered each other. So first you think, well, water people, that sounds like Atlantis. Maybe, this is who we're talking about. But what I found from doing the research is that the myth more likely originates with the expansion of the land people who were moving out of the region of modern Mauritania. That is where the Rashat structure is located. So if there is any grounding in truth to the myth of this Atlantean expansion, maybe the expansion of these land people all the way across North Africa, maybe that was the seed of a story which, became combined with the story of a natural disaster, mythologized over years. And then, we find it in a version that, Plato's telling us from 2,400 years ago. It's a remarkable possibility where you start to see, okay, maybe this isn't exactly what happened. But what if the seeds of the truth of some, massive migration were what was underlying this story?
You write about the chariot and the gymnasium, even boathouses cut in stone, real-world echoes of Atlantis's descriptions. What are these finds, and where do they exist today?
Yeah, so this is a one that was a few. I'm sorry to tell people, a few falsehoods, right? No evidence of the use of chariots in Western Africa, going back that far in time, certainly. Gymnasiums were not really invented as we know them until 600 or 700, maybe 800 BC. So when Plato describes, and these are the words he uses, right? Gymnasiums were here. That can't really be real as far as we know it. It may be not in the form that we think of. Or, and again, is the mistake, I think that it's a mistake to assume this is all true or it's all false. The underlying current of the story could have truth to it, a disaster, an expansion of people, conquering people they overcame and things of that nature. But were they using chariots? Probably not. And then, the boathouses cut in stone. I had the pleasure to visit some of these types of structures in ancient Greece, in Greece myself, and see them. And look, these are massive type of dry docks where boats would be worked on in ancient Greece, and then they would launch them and so forth. So if things like this existed in the Rashat, they should be visible, right? They again, I sort of make the caveat that vast archaeological work has not been done out at that site. We might discover a society that was similar to like a Göbekli Tepe type of society. We might uncover stone carvings or ruins or more things that we haven't found yet that could be buried under the sand and so forth. I'm only going to deal with what we have found or what we do know to date. So you have to separate, hey, this is totally possible. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates this type of advancement at that time was completely possible. Knowledge of astronomy, boats, sailing, woodcrafting, stone tools, military, all that kind of stuff. All that was going on. But where's we found the evidence that can support that yet? And I'm not sure the answer is yes.
What are the vitals from Atlantis? What do we know either from Plato's writing, or I believe it was one of was it Timaeus's or Critias's ancestors who went to Egypt, and they had sort of documented some of the history on their temple walls. I mean, what do we know for sure about Atlanteans? What did they look like? How many lived in this area? What were they good at?
Right. Yeah. This is the damnable part about all this, is that, some people have tried to connect the Atlantis story to some of the Egyptian mythology. I don't think particularly successfully, and Graham Hancock's done that and some others, but I think it's a little bit of a stretch. You could say maybe some of those elements influence the idea of this story, but I think if this story existed in its real form, it came from West Africa. It was something that was absorbed through trade routes and retold. The story is that Solon, who was one of the 7 sages of ancient Greece, had traveled to the Temple of Sais, which was in the Egyptian Nile Delta, around probably 593 BC, I'm going to say. So Solon, who was a noted statesman and sort of drafter of the Athenian constitution, was a pretty smart guy, very well educated. And when he showed up at the Temple of Sais, the story Plato tells goes, while he started talking with these priests about, ancient history, and he gave his own account of the Greeks' version of ancient history. And invariably, Richard, the farther back he got, it sort of devolved into myth. Well, we have these flood myths, and, we have this, and, probably it was all started by, Athena at some point in time, right? And the Egyptian priests just sort of laugh at him and say, you Greeks have no idea about your own past. And we here in Egypt, we know it all because we've got it all written down on our temple walls. The unfortunate part about this, Richard, is that the Temple of Sais is now destroyed, and or its ruins are buried quite deep under the Nile Delta. And I don't think more than kind of the top layers have been excavated. I could be wrong about that. But, the Egyptians say, hey, our culture goes back to like 8600 BC. And you Athenians, we know you guys will go back at least 1,000 years earlier because we know about this war that you guys fought. And that's the war where you guys drove back these battled Atlanteans and pushed them all the way back to their capital city, and you defeated them. But at the moment of your victory, there were these earthquakes and floods, and their city was destroyed, but your own army was also wiped out. So critics of the Atlantis story have often said, well, how convenient, Plato. All the evidence got wiped out, by a flood, and nobody's dug up any, ancient Greek armor in the Western Sahara or Mauritania, as far as I'm aware. But again, this might have been an element of the story that was introduced by Plato as a parable about the Peloponnesian War of his own era. Mm. So really, what I do in the book here is I try and tell George's story. We try and take a real hard look at the scientific evidence for and against which elements of the Atlantis story could be true. Boats, warfare, astronomy, trade networks that span continents, that's all real. And then we look at, the Platonic philosophy. how did Plato weave these different elements into the story, and why did he do it? Why did he leave the end of the story hanging? What's he trying to tell us about this? Because, the idea here is that the Egyptians are saying, look, you Greeks don't know your own history. You didn't have just one ancient flood. I know that you guys had many floods. So your civilization rose and fell. And this probably sounds familiar. We know today of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. We know at least 3 intermediate periods in Egyptian history that we know of, and each one came after a period of high culture, Richard, where you have the great, all these pyramids and so forth, and then boom, you have this 500-year dark age, and then they rise, the Middle Kingdom rises, and then you have another dark age, and then the New Kingdom rises, and then they take a dive. Well, I think Plato is really talking about this concept of the cyclicality of civilization.
Right. And how many earlier Atlantises have we already forgotten?
And that's one of the things that blew my mind when, if you look at the thing you mentioned earlier, the wooden structure they dug up in Zambia, which is in sort of South Central Africa, from, 475,000 years ago. As far as we know, that predates Homo sapiens by 160,000 years. And people didn't really think people were building stuff back then. Here you have these wooden beams. They were clearly cut by, tools. They're joined together. They're only preserved because of the unique conditions of this sort of clay mud that held them. Well, what else do we not have? And this makes me think, well, if people were building buildings for 500,000 years, what the hell else don't we know? And this is where you start to get into the speculation, and as you probably gleaned from our conversations, I'm very hesitant to speculate, but I think I'll go out on a limb and say I think it's entirely possible that over hundreds of thousands of years, how many civilizations do we just not even know anything about? It could be vast civilizations. I mean, think about the Mongolians. They didn't really build very much. All their cities and things were built by the people they conquered. They conquered people, then they put them to work building them stuff, and which is a great strategy. But these guys that weren't builders, but they occupied a vast empire, and you could imagine similar fact sets. The other thing that it makes you wonder about is, have you ever heard of the Eocene layers of mysterious origin?
No, I mean, is that Michael Cremo in Forbidden Archaeology?
Well, there was a paper that came out many years ago called the Silurian hypothesis. You ever hear about that?
No, I don't think so.
So this is, I think people who are interested in lost civilizations will appreciate this. This is from 55 million years ago, and there are these, deposits from the Eocene epoch that, for all intents and purposes, look as if they could have been made by an industrial civilization. The mainstream explanation for this is a lot of volcanic eruption activity, mimicking, the type what you would get from industrial, smoke and things of that nature. But one of the things they point out in that is they say, well, look, we're not saying there was some kind of, 55 million year old reptilian factory society. We're saying we don't know that there wasn't. And you can't prove either way. You can look at the evidence and say, well, we can come up with a natural cause for this. Or you can look at the evidence and you can say, I think it was, Silurians or whatever, whatever beings created this. And I think that's a wonderful exercise, and we should have a little bit more humility because, again, every discovery we make pushes the timeline back further. You can find these weird artifacts like the Antikythera mechanism, which doesn't seem like it should have existed at the time. And the other piece I dug up in the history here is you got to remember, almost every great wonder of the ancient world is gone today because it was either destroyed in an earthquake or, got melted, like the Colossus of Rhodes, right? got hauled off and melted down for scrap by a Jewish merchant from Edessa in like 1400, something like that. So one of the wonders of the ancient world is probably now a teaspoon in some guy's coffee shop in Turkey. Amazing. You know, I mean, and think about the lighthouse of Pharos. It's in rubble. It's under the water in Alexandria. I mean, the Great Pyramid of Egypt is the only one that's still standing, and this is just from the last 2,500 years. So I just think it's some food for thought.
Well, in the book, you compare today's world, looking at a potential future ruin, like the Hoover Dam, which is built to last like 10,000 years. What would future archaeologists conclude about us if we vanished tomorrow?
I think that's a question we all ought to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, right? And I think that's one of the lessons Plato actually intended with this story of Atlantis. Is he was telling this to a Greek audience, right? It wasn't just a history lesson about, hey, gee, do you know about some interesting guys who once lived in North Africa a long time ago? It was, you can't remember your own past. You know, you don't know your own culture. And I think I like to imagine the future 10,000 years from now. Well, what are they going to think about us? What are they going to find? What's going to be left? And if the Hoover Dam lasts for 9,999 years, but then the next year it breaks and there's an earthquake and it gets all turned into rubble and washed down the Colorado River, what's going to be left? Maybe someday somebody finds a piece of a turbine and they say, well, they had metal working back in those days. And you can see this ceremonial bin that they probably put grain into, you know? No one's going to have the idea. What else is going to be left? Plastic will deteriorate in a few hundred or a few thousand years. The only thing that's going to be left is, frankly, nuclear waste, radioactivity. And there's actually a guy, I'm blanking on his name, but it's called the Memory of Mankind Project. And I actually had the privilege to go and see where this place is. It's in Hallstatt, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong in the German, Hallstatt salt mine in Austria, where they've buried this archive on ceramic tablets to try to think of a future era where our modern society has fallen into, ruin, whether through nuclear war or through natural disaster. And one of the things they've included in there is the locations of all the nuclear waste sites around the earth to tell future people, or who knows what, cockroach people or whatever, hey guys, avoid these areas, don't go here, which is a remarkably thoughtful gesture. And Hallstatt it'll probably be there in 10,000 years,
Why does academia still fear to touch the Atlantis question? Is it ego? Is it funding? Is it the threat of rewriting history?
I think it's stigma. And I think that very few, I mentioned Scott Ashford at Oregon State University. He's one of the few people who understood that myth and reality, they might not be one-to-one, but there's overlap. And he understood right away what I was talking about when I went to, discuss with him. I said, hey, look, some elements of this story can't be true, but hey, here's a place that matches the geography. Do you think a flood could have happened here? And he said 100%, and here's how it would have gone. I think that most academics, if you think about it, Richard, these are people who are brought up in a kind of orthodoxy, and the academic way is to read all this stuff and then make like an incremental conclusion as if that idea naturally followed from all these other previous ideas. But you and I know that that's not the way advancement happens, right? I mean, how'd the telephone get invented? Was it an incremental change in previous earlier telephone versions? It was not. Right. So where do these ideas, where do these flashes of innovation come from? Well, I don't have the answer to that. You're going to have to talk to someone smarter than I am about that. But, I just think that academia this is a taboo subject, right? You can talk about the philosophy of the Timaeus or the Critias, but if you start trying to investigate and untangle the Atlantis story, you're going to be laughed at. Your funding is going to be cut. You know, you're not going to get that promotion. Maybe you're not going to get tenure. And I think there's a lot, right? I mean, people have families, they have bills to pay. They've invested a decade or more decades of their lives into this orthodoxy. And so they're not being rewarded for examining the ancient past, I think, or more than that, mythology, right? Trying to parse out mythology and figure out what was true and what was embellishment. Because what's the reward for that? They're not being rewarded the same way that people who work in the sciences are being rewarded. Oh, gee, great. You invented a new polymer. Great. Here's 10 million bucks. You know, well, thanks so much. What a genius you are, right? No one's going to look at this, which is why it took an outsider like George Sarantitis, who understood Greek very well and who was fascinated and well-grounded in philosophy, to go back and look at this story and point to something that was there the whole damn time, right? Those words, the Greek hasn't changed in the last few hundred years. Our understanding, interpretation, he knew that there were other pieces and he figured out how these things fit together. So what I can take credit for is telling his story, but then trying to satisfy my own curiosity in this book after I made the film and saying, hey, how much more can I find out about this? And then you start finding this stuff in Zambia, or you start finding the boats in Southeast Asia, and you say, if we have these tantalizing pieces of evidence, what does that mean? What about all the blanks that we can't fill in? And I think that's the story of possibility. The ancient past isn't dead. We know so little about our own past. Graham Hancock does like to use that we're a species with amnesia. Well, in a sense, Plato, that was his message to the Greek society of his own era. And most of us barely even know about the Greeks from 2,500 years ago, who themselves might not have known about what came 2,500 years before them, and it just keeps going backward.
If Plato were alive today, what would he think of how his story has been interpreted? What would he say to George Sarantitis?
I think he'd commend Sarantitis he might say, you know, you're the first guy in about 2,000 years who got what I was trying to get at. Because that's the last part of the book. Is I spend a lot of time going back kind of to my classical education, rereading a lot of books and saying, okay, what was Plato trying to tell us here? And what you start to see as you peel back the onion, Richard, is there's layer upon layer upon layer of allusions to things like the Iliad and the Odyssey and Herodotus and Thucydides and all these other authors. And he sort of created this remarkable, this remarkable construct of ideas. And each idea kind of leads to another idea. And just to sort of, to wrap that up, at the end of the film, we talk about this, where, I think this idea of the cutoff end of Critias, George was the first person to see, hey, wait a minute, this connects right back to the first page of the Odyssey. This wasn't cut off by accident or because Plato was too lazy to finish writing the book. He did it on purpose. He wants us to see something. He wants us to look backward at the past. He wants us to consider what this message is. And I think part of the message is, hey, if you don't take care of your society today, you're doomed to go on a pretty long and painful odyssey just to get back to where you started, whether it's war or, famine or climate disasters. If you don't take care of the present, you're going to wind up an ancient myth yourself.
That's a valuable lesson for us today. The Atlantis Puzzle, the true story of ancient Greece, Africa, and climate change across deep time. Jack Kelley, thank you so much. How do we get a copy?
You can find it internationally on Amazon, wherever you are, and Barnes & Nobles as well, just so Jeff Bezos doesn't get all the money.
And how can we screen the Atlantis Puzzle documentary?
You can find that also on Amazon Prime, and other platforms like Tubi or Google. Google it, you'll sure to be finding it.
Fantastic. Jack, great speaking with you again. Thank you so much.
Richard, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
A new Richard Syrett's Strange Planet drops every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.